Welcome to World at Work TV. I'm Allison Avalos, and I'm joined today by Sharon Podstupka of Meyer and Partners, and we're talking about how to create an effective pay communication strategy. Sharon, we know historically that pay communications tend to receive low marks from both employees and compensation professionals. This is definitely a challenge for organizations. What do you think is holding them back or getting in the way?
I think there are a couple of things, and I would actually add to that. I think companies are now rating themselves fairly low on the scale of quality and effectiveness with respect to pay communication. So there's recognition that there's room for improvement. I think it boils down to two things. One is timing. So practitioners, management, they spend so much time designing plans that it ends up bumping up against either an approval from the board or comp committee meetings, and then the next thing you know, this plan is effective, and they haven't thought through how they're going to talk to, a broad array of stakeholders. So I think time always runs out. The second thing, and a little more interesting, are the resources that are being brought in to do the work. So typically what we see, or what we've seen, are compensation managers who know the technical detail of these plans really well, stuck up against the wall because of the timing, just putting out the facts. And the translation isn't coming through to the participant. I think that also translates outside too. We talk a lot about shareholder communication and the importance of proxies and clarity and CD&As. And it's the time barrier. We run out of time, so we get the facts down and don't really think about how people are receiving that information or what's really resonating.
So how can organizations get out in front of some of these challenges, in particular for those who maybe are just at the early stages of putting together a pay communication strategy?
I think it's important to take a step back and take stock of the really good things that you've done. Again, I think a lot of the plan design work, even some of the presentations that companies and management are giving to their boards, have to be boiled down to key points and themes. And leveraging that to create even a storyboard for what you might say to a certain pocket of your employees, whether it be executives who are eligible for a distinct long-term incentive plan, or even deeper down in the organization, maybe you've got a larger segment that's eligible for an annual incentive plan. What are the things you need to talk to them about? And then thinking about all of the other communications activities on your HR timeline, which means talking to other people in your HR organization about when am I going to have some airspace to really get people's attention. I think that's a great starting point. I also think committing to doing it and getting the buy-in from leadership and other stakeholders like legal and finance who are always intimately involved in these designs to say, we need to make an investment in time to make sure that we're plotting out the right strategy to talk to people.
I'm sensing from all I'm hearing that you've probably seen a lot of organizations who aren't thinking early enough about their pay communications. Would that be fair to say?
I think it is, and I think that we've done some recent research. This is more in the disclosure space that tells us that companies who plan earlier in the year, so 3 to 6 months before the end of their fiscal year, to start putting together key messages about pay, how it links to the performance of that particular year and what that might mean for pay outcomes, are seeing better results, not just in, say, on pay, but how the outside world sees the value of their programs and understands the linkage between pay and performance.
So how about during the performance period? What tips would you have for organizations to stay in touch?
I love this question because it's a really tricky one. Mm-hmm. I think, first and foremost, a lot of people don't even understand performance cycles. Mm-hmm. So taking a step back and saying, we have an incentive plan that's based on a 3-year time frame, for example, and understanding what measures are being looked at over that time period and why. And then helping people stay on track or understand how the business is doing over that time gets a little bit dicier depending upon the metrics, in particular for public companies. So the tip that I would put out there is, if you are a public company, to think about how you cascade messages to the outside and then work from there. So, for example, I had an organization that developed a quarterly update to their workforce, to those who were in an incentive plan, and it immediately followed their analyst calls. So they weren't leaking information to the street, because that's very sensitive. Their legal folks played a very important role in making sure the timing was right, and then helping the managers or HR business partners explain what people could do in their own jobs to affect results. It worked really well.
So Sharon, you've worked with a lot of organizations. Is there a number one mistake that you see organizations making when it comes to pay communications?
Not getting the right team of people together from the onset to agree on key messages and what the purpose of this program is intended to do, and how you're going to translate that into conversations with people so they can walk away feeling that their program has value, that their management teams are making good decisions and have sound governance practices. That's really where I see companies not spending enough time and thought, which translates to, a poor rollout.
You mentioned at the outset of our conversation that organizations often are rushed at the end because they're waiting for approval from their board, and everything tends to move very quickly at the end. But it also sounds like there's an opportunity to put together some framework for how you're going to communicate, even if the specific message needs to be tweaked there at the end. Talk a little bit about the kinds of things that organizations can be thinking about and maybe even starting to build before they get to that final stage.
The best thing a company can do when they're starting to talk about plan design is bring a communicator on board from the beginning. And I think it's a challenge sometimes because being an HR communicator, you're broad. You know lots of things about lots of different topics, and you may not be as deep in certain aspects of those topics, whether it be benefits or compensation. But having a communicator at the table from the very beginning helps that person understand what the changes are, why they're being made, and generally have a good sense of what works well in terms of delivery methods for particular audiences. So having that person on board just to even hear the debates about whether a certain feature of a plan makes sense, and even getting to that board approval, I think is of tremendous value, because that person can step aside from time to time and start building that strategy for you to say, here are some things you should think about as you not only get to approval from the board, but when you're ready to hit go and talk to people or participants in the plan.
So how about communications that go through managers and executives in particular? Because there are lots of forms of communication. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of that specific communication channel?
There are distinct challenges for sure. I think one in particular with managers who are not HR people, they've got lots of other things going on. And sometimes they don't speak the language of compensation, and it's hard to train them. It's hard to find the time to train them. It's hard to get buy-in sometimes, to take them off of a line or distract them from something, to make sure that they have the right elevator speech to have those meaningful conversations with their employees. I think the true advantage of having a manager be able to have those conversations is that we know from research, and you've done the research too, that employees really do connect better with their people managers as opposed to a corporate compensation function or a corporate HR function. So it's worth the time and effort to do that. I also think with executives too, I think that leadership voice is very important, and having your leaders understand what their role is in communicating the value of pay and total rewards in general, and what it means to the business, what it means to building value and personal wealth creation is really important.
Thanks, Sharon.
You're welcome.
For World at Work TV, I'm Allison Avalos.